Hi everybody, it's Dr. Landeck. So today we're going to talk about, or this week, we're going to talk about the American West. And I'm going to do a couple of different little micro lectures for you. But I want you to think of some big ideas while you're doing your readings and you're watching these crash course videos. Then I'm going to give you some kind of, kind of an old-fashioned lecture a little bit too, with some big ideas as well. When you're thinking about this reading and the work that you're doing on the American West today, I want you to think about this reality that we're talking about the same time period that we were talking about last week with Reconstruction. So, and it'll be the same time period we're talking about next week. We're layering different ideas over the same time period. Think of the Reconstruction was the 1860s to 1870s and 80s that we were talking about. And the American West, we're going to do the same. We're going to talk about the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And then next week we'll do the same, 1860s, 70s, 80s, up to the 1890s. So we're going to talk about these very different things that are going on in the same years. And I think sometimes that can be confusing, that you've got all these things that are happening at the same time. But if you think about it this way, imagine somebody in the future trying to teach a class on the year 2020, just 1 year, right? Now, I suspect there will be entire classes and entire books on 2020 because it's such an odd time. But think about this. Think about how you would teach it, right? You can't teach it all at once. We can barely handle it all at once, and we're living through it. So if you were teaching 2020 to a class, you'd layer it, right? You'd talk about race in America and all the different things that have come about in 2020 with the destruction of Confederate monuments and conversations about the past in that way, about the Black Lives Matter movement and how important that's become, and how George Floyd's death has really brought a lot of people into that fold that maybe didn't understand it before until they really saw it for themselves. You'd spend time on the pandemic, right? And how that changed over the course of the year, and those realities of what people thought and what people felt. And that's partly why we do those pandemic journals, so that we can add to that piece of knowledge. You would talk about the election and the politics of the day. And you wouldn't do it all at once. You'd have a couple of weeks on one thing, a couple of weeks on the other, maybe a couple of weeks on the reality of the economy and the jobs that are being lost, who's losing their jobs and who's not, who's quitting their jobs to stay home and make sure their kids are educated, all those different things. So the past is the same. It's complicated, just like our lives today is complicated. So think about, that's why we layer. That's why we talk about these things. That's why in high school and middle school, you got such little pieces of information, because there's so much out there to really understand an era. So that's what we're going to do these first few weeks. Now, the second part of the semester, we'll hit the 20th century and we'll kind of pick up speed moving through time, not because the 20th century is any less complicated. It's more complicated if that's possible, but because we want to reach the present and we need to keep moving, and we can combine things in a different way. Okay, so our discussion of the American West, I want you to think of some big picture things. I want you to think, as you're doing your reading, think of some big ideas of, how do we define the West? What is the West? Where is the West? Is Texas part of the West, or is Texas part of the South? This is a much debated question and something for you to consider as well, since we live here. But think about that. What is the West, and when is the West? Does the West start with Lewis and Clark leaving St. Louis and heading west in 1803, or does it start much later, after the Civil War? When does the West become defined? And again, where? Think too about who we're talking about here in the West. Who is part of the West? And one of the important pieces that we're going to talk about, and your readings talk about and make clear, is this reality that the West is a very diverse place. It's the most diverse part of the United States, where much of the East Coast has been dominated racially by you have Native Americans that were there, but then a lot of European settlers, often white European settlers that came to the East and were there. Where you have slavery is in the Deep South, and so that is going to add some racial diversity there. You've got Spanish West, right? Spain controlled much of the South, and other native Mexicans that were part of the South adds that layer of diversity there. Great Native American tribes that were originated in the West and then were moved to the West forcefully in the 1800s. And then you're also going to have a lot of diversity coming from Asia. You have a lot of immigration from China and places like that that is going to add a whole nother layer of diversity of Asians and Asian Americans to the West as well. So the West is a very diverse place and always has been a very diverse place from the very beginning. So keep that in mind too as you're thinking about this. Think too about this big picture idea of, and your textbook author does a good job of this, I think, as well, of putting the settlement of the American West, the conquering, if you will, of the American West, putting into global conquest. What's happening to the Aborigines in Australia? What's happening to different people around the world as their industrialized neighbors decide they need to spread to their region? And so you have some real parallels where the story of Native Americans or the indigenous people of the Americas is something that you may be familiar with from middle school and high school. Think broader now. Put that into the global context of, well, this isn't the only place this was happening. This was happening in different places to different peoples. And so that really does kind of put it all into context and see how industrialization really does make these actions on a global scale. Right? I want you to think about this too, and your textbook author talks about this a little bit too, and your crash course video talks about this as well. This idea of the American myth, right? Pull out a piece of paper right now before you go into your readings, before you go into your crash course video, and write down, what do you think of when you think of the American West, right? Your big picture things. What do you think of? Are you thinking about a cowboy, right? Are you thinking about horses, right? What are you thinking about? What are your images of the West? And jot some notes down. And then after you've come through all of this and this idea of who those people are or what those images are that you have, at the end of your readings and your work through this module, think about that again. Has that changed? Has your image of what the West is changed? I think it might. It might not, but it just might. Right? So think about that myth of the American West and what that myth is, and whether that's helpful or harmful. I don't know. Maybe it's just a good story. But is it reality? Probably not. Okay. All right. So that gives you some big picture ideas of things to think about. Go ahead and be reading your chapter and watching that crash course video. And then I'm going to have another little micro lecture with some of the big picture things that I want to make sure that you get out of your readings. And just I like you to know. Okay. Again, email me with any questions. Thanks.